What really happened behind the quiet, cautious demeanor of James Buchanan, the man who led America into its darkest pre-Civil War days? From personal heartbreak to political silence, every decision, delay, and moral evasion revealed a leader unprepared for a nation on the edge. How did a man so brilliant in law and diplomacy watch the Union unravel under his watch? Join us as we uncover the hidden tragedies, shocking choices and consequences of a presidency defined by fear, indecision, and the refusal to act when it mattered most. The paradox at the bottom of history. At the moment James Buchanan stepped onto the national stage, nothing about him suggested disaster. He was not a fiery outsider or an untested populist. He was, by every conventional measure of the 19th century, the safest possible choice a nervous republic could make. His rise was steady, calculated, and almost dull in its predictability. That was precisely why Americans trusted him. Long before the presidency, Buchanan had built a resume unmatched by any of his contemporaries. He had served in Congress when the nation was still defining its identity. He had negotiated treaties abroad while Europe treated the United States as a junior power. He had advised presidents, shaped legislation, and mastered constitutional arguments with the precision of a courtroom veteran. Voters did not see ambition in him. They saw reassurance. What made Buchanan extraordinary was not brilliance, but balance. In an era dominated by towering personalities and ideological crusaders, he appeared immune to excess. He spoke carefully, avoided rhetorical extremes, and projected the calm of a man who believed history rewarded restraint. Newspapers praised his seriousness. Allies admired his reliability. Enemies struggled to define what exactly he stood for, which only increased his appeal. By the time he ran for president, Buchanan represented something rare. He was not just experienced, he was overqualified. He had been senator, secretary of state, minister to Russia, minister to Britain, and legal advisor at the highest levels of government. No other president would enter office with such a long and varied record of national service already behind him. To many Americans, his election felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. That inevitability became his paradox. Buchanan was chosen not because he promised transformation, but because he promised continuity. In a nation already showing deep fractures, voters believed stability itself was leadership. They believed that if someone understood the rules well enough, the system would protect itself. Buchanan embodied that belief so perfectly that few questioned whether the moment demanded something else entirely. Privately, Buchanan reinforced this image. He was meticulous in habit, formal in speech, and deeply conscious of history's judgment. He kept detailed notes, preserved correspondence, and spoke often of constitutional boundaries. He did not view himself as a hero in waiting, but as a steward. His task, as he saw it, was not to shape events, but to manage them safely through established channels. Yet beneath this calm exterior sat an untested assumption. Buchanan had never faced a crisis that demanded immediate moral clarity over procedural correctness. His career had unfolded during moments when delay was survivable and compromise was praised. Each success quietly confirmed his belief that patience was not avoidance, but wisdom. The longer he served, the more convinced he became that dramatic action was the true danger. The nation, however, was changing faster than Buchanan realized. While he perfected caution, political tensions hardened into absolutes. While he trusted institutions, public faith in those institutions eroded. The very qualities that once made him indispensable now insulated him from urgency. He mistook silence for control and balance for strength. Historians would later struggle to reconcile the contradiction. How could the most prepared president become the most widely condemned? How could a man trusted by nearly every faction fail so completely when unity mattered most? The answer does not lie in incompetence or malice. It lies in a worldview that could not adapt when the rules themselves were no longer enough. Buchanan did not fall into history's cellar by accident. He descended there slowly, step by careful step, carrying credentials that lost relevance as the ground shifted beneath him. His tragedy is not that he misunderstood the nation. It is that the nation believed he could not. But what shaped a man so perfectly for order and so disastrously for upheaval? Stay with us as the mystery deepens. A mind built for law, not crisis. Long before James Buchanan ever imagined himself as president, his instincts were already fixed. They were not shaped by crowds or campaigns, but by books, courts, and an early belief that society functioned best when rules were obeyed precisely as written. Where others learned to lead by rallying people, Buchanan learned to trust systems. Raised in a strict Presbyterian household in rural Pennsylvania, Buchanan grew up in an environment where discipline mattered more than passion. Moral certainty was prized, emotional expression restrained, and deviation discouraged. From an early age, he absorbed the idea that stability came from adherence, not improvisation. This worldview did not limit him intellectually. It disciplined him psychologically. His education reinforced this foundation. At Dickinson College, Buchanan excelled not because he challenged ideas, but because he mastered them. He gravitated toward logic, precedent, and structure. Professors noted his seriousness, his discomfort with disorder, and his preference for arguments that could be neatly resolved. Law was not simply a profession for him. It was a refuge where ambiguity could be controlled. When Buchanan entered legal practice, he quickly gained a reputation for precision. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply respectful of procedural boundaries. Judges trusted him. Clients valued his restraint. Unlike flashier lawyers who sought dramatic courtroom victories, Buchanan preferred airtight reasoning. Winning mattered, but winning correctly mattered more. That mindset followed him into public life. As a young congressman, Buchanan avoided fiery speeches and ideological crusades. Instead, he studied committee rules, parliamentary procedures, and constitutional constraints. While others chased attention, he chased consensus. He believed politics worked best when personalities disappeared behind process. This approach brought early rewards. Buchanan was seen as dependable in moments when volatility frightened lawmakers. He was consulted often, elevated steadily, and rarely blamed when legislation stalled. His ability to explain why something could not be done earned him as much respect as proposals for what should be done. In Washington, caution could look like wisdom. Yet this legal devotion came with a hidden cost. Buchanan trained himself to believe that action outside formal authority was inherently dangerous. He viewed decisive leadership without explicit constitutional permission as a step toward chaos. Over time, this belief hardened into reflex. When faced with uncertainty, his instinct was not to act carefully, but to wait entirely. Unlike leaders who adapt under pressure, Buchanan resisted urgency. Crisis, to him, was evidence that rules were being ignored, not signals that they needed interpretation. Where others saw moments requiring judgment, he saw risks of overreach. His fear was not of failure, but of precedent. This fear shaped his decision-making quietly, but consistently. Buchanan often asked not whether something needed to be done, but whether it could be done without violating established norms. If the answer was unclear, he retreated. In calmer times, this made him appear thoughtful. In turbulent times, it made him invisible. Even his language reflected this restraint. Buchanan spoke in legal constructions, conditional phrasing, and careful qualifications. He avoided moral absolutes, preferring constitutional logic over ethical declaration. This made him difficult to quote and harder to rally behind. Supporters trusted his mind, but rarely felt inspired by his voice. As sectional tensions intensified nationwide, Buchanan's legal faith remained intact. He believed deeply that if everyone respected the Constitution as written, conflict would resolve itself. He did not consider that different groups interpreted that same document in incompatible ways. His training had taught him that law clarified disagreement. Reality was beginning to prove otherwise. What Buchanan never recognized was that law alone cannot compel loyalty when belief collapses. Rules require shared commitment to function. When that commitment fractures, leadership must step beyond procedure to restore trust. Buchanan, however, had spent a lifetime learning how not to do that. The skills that elevated him had quietly narrowed his capacity to respond when rigidity became dangerous. His mind was sharp, disciplined, and principled. It was also ill-equipped for moments when rules could no longer contain human urgency. But long before national crisis would test these limits, a far more personal rupture reshaped Buchanan's emotional world in ways he never publicly acknowledged. What happens when a man trained to suppress disorder is confronted with a loss no rule can explain? Come with us to explore the hidden corners of the story. The engagement that ended a life and a future. The rupture did not arrive with warning or spectacle. It entered Buchanan's life quietly, through affection, hope, and a future he allowed himself to imagine only once. After years of discipline and guarded ambition, he did something entirely out of character. He fell in love. Anne Caroline Coleman was not part of Washington society or political calculation. She was young, wealthy, sharp-minded, and emotionally expressive in ways Buchanan was not. Their engagement promised something Buchanan had long postponed, a private life beyond duty. For a man who had spent decades measuring every decision, this commitment represented vulnerability. Yet even in intimacy, Buchanan struggled to adapt. He remained consumed by career obligations, traveling frequently and writing infrequently. His letters were formal when reassurance was needed. His absences grew longer, just as expectations grew deeper. Anne's friends began to question his intentions. Rumors spread that Buchanan cared more for her fortune than her affection. What happened next unfolded with devastating speed. Misunderstandings hardened into silence. A letter, never fully recovered, arrived too late or said too little. Anne returned her engagement ring. Days later, she collapsed suddenly and died, likely from an overdose of laudanum, though the precise cause was never definitively established. The social response was unforgiving. Anne's family barred Buchanan from the funeral. Whispers of blame followed him into public spaces. Whether he caused her despair or merely failed to prevent it mattered little. In the eyes of many, he had failed at the most human of responsibilities. Buchanan never spoke publicly about her death. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He withdrew. Friends noted a visible change. His already reserved nature hardened into emotional quarantine. Where ambition once coexisted with personal hope, now only duty remained. This moment altered him permanently. Unlike political defeats which he analyzed and learned from, this loss offered no procedural lesson. There was no appeal, no correction, no constitutional remedy. It confronted him with the limits of restraint itself. His instinctive response was not confrontation, but erasure. From that point forward, Buchanan severed the possibility of personal attachment. He never married. He avoided deep emotional relationships. His household became a place of order, not warmth. Companionship was replaced with routine. Feeling was replaced with function. Importantly, this withdrawal did not weaken his career. In fact, it accelerated it. Free from personal obligations, Buchanan devoted himself entirely to public life. Colleagues admired his focus. Superiors valued his availability. He became the man who never missed a meeting, never hesitated to relocate, never placed private need above public service. But something essential was lost in the exchange. The grief he never processed did not fade. It calcified. He learned to suppress empathy not because he lacked it, but because it had once overwhelmed him. Emotional distance became not just protection, but policy. This detachment subtly reshaped his leadership style. Buchanan grew increasingly uncomfortable with conflict rooted in passion. He preferred disputes framed as technical disagreements rather than moral ones. When debates grew heated, he retreated into formality. Feeling to him became destabilizing. Historians often search for political motives behind Buchanan's later decisions. Few acknowledge the psychological architecture beneath them. His resistance to emotional confrontation did not originate in cowardice. It originated in trauma left unresolved. He associated emotional engagement with irreversible loss. This helps explain a pattern that would later define his presidency. When confronted with human suffering, Buchanan responded with procedural calm. When urgency demanded moral clarity, he offered legal reasoning. He was not indifferent, he was guarded. Anne Coleman's death closed a door Buchanan never reopened. It did not end his ambition, but it redirected it inward. Politics became safer than intimacy. Law became safer than feeling. Distance became safer than decision. The nation would one day demand from him precisely what he had trained himself never to give: emotional presence in the face of irreversible stakes. But how does a man who chooses solitude as survival begin to lead a country tearing itself apart? Let us guide you into what no one expected. Choosing solitude as a shield. After Anne Coleman's death, Buchanan's retreat from personal life became deliberate, almost ritualistic. He built a fortress of solitude, not with bricks or walls, but with routine, etiquette, and distance. Where others sought companionship to share burdens, he sought refuge in the predictable, the measurable, and the controllable. His heart became a locked archive, catalogued but inaccessible. This withdrawal was evident in every sphere of his existence. Social invitations were declined or accepted with calculated brevity. Colleagues noted he avoided casual conversation. Letters became shorter, strictly formal, leaving emotion between the lines where few would notice. Even at family gatherings, Buchanan maintained a polite reserve, separating himself from warmth and sentiment that once might have softened his focus. The psychological armor he fashioned had a peculiar effect on his political persona. His reputation for impartiality strengthened as his emotional neutrality became visible. Senators and diplomats found him a reliable partner in negotiation precisely because he did not appear to carry personal vendettas or biases. Where other politicians reacted with feeling, Buchanan calculated and measured, reinforcing an image of calm competence. Yet the cost was subtle but profound. The very solitude that shielded him from grief also limited his capacity for empathy. He could analyze conflicts, foresee outcomes, and craft procedural responses. But the human dimension, the urgency, the fear, the hope, often went unnoticed. He had traded emotional risk for clarity of purpose, but clarity does not always equal wisdom. Solitude also influenced his decision-making style. Buchanan became methodical to a fault, often delaying action until the law, precedent, or consensus could provide complete guidance. He avoided confrontations that required moral judgment or emotional engagement. In debates, he excelled at framing issues in terms of process rather than consequence. Decisions were intellectual exercises, not moral reckonings. This retreat was reinforced by his lifestyle. Buchanan rarely traveled for pleasure, avoided personal friendships that demanded intimacy, and conducted his household with military-like order. He immersed himself in policy memoranda, diplomatic correspondence, and legislative minutiae. The world of abstract systems became more comforting than the world of human unpredictability. At the same time, this emotional quarantine allowed Buchanan to rise where others faltered. Ambition, once entangled with personal vulnerability, now flowed unimpeded toward public service. He could dedicate time and attention that others reserved for families or social obligations. His focus was singular, his loyalty undivided, and his availability unmatched. The paradox was clear. Buchanan's shielded heart made him simultaneously stronger and weaker. Stronger because he could devote himself entirely to politics, diplomatic negotiations, and legal mastery. Weaker because the very qualities that made him reliable under calm circumstances left him unprepared for crises fueled by fear, anger, and moral urgency. Observers sometimes misread this. They attributed his caution to prudence, his silence to patience, and his avoidance of conflict to wisdom. Few saw the root cause, a personal tragedy reshaping the architecture of his mind. The man who avoided intimacy had also learned to avoid moral confrontation, emotional reckoning, and decisive action when stakes were human rather than procedural. The shield of solitude would become both his signature and his vulnerability. In Congress, he would navigate partisan battles with uncanny skill. Abroad, he would negotiate treaties that preserved peace. Yet in moments when history demanded courage and engagement, that same shield would turn into a barrier, preventing him from stepping into the role the nation required. Buchanan's isolation had created a paradoxical power. He could influence endlessly without exposure, yet he could never fully connect when connection mattered most. His private life became a laboratory for control, and the lessons he drew there would echo into his presidency in ways few could anticipate. So when a man has perfected distance as both weapon and refuge, can he ever truly respond when the world demands closeness, moral clarity, and decisive action? Stay here as the next twist unfolds. Rising by never taking sides. Buchanan's isolation did more than protect him. It became the engine of his political ascent. In a nation increasingly polarized by sectional tensions, his refusal to stake a passionate claim on any divisive issue became a strategic advantage. Where others angered constituencies, Buchanan remained above the fray, a figure who could be trusted to mediate, negotiate, and, crucially, delay. In Congress, he cultivated the skill of neutrality as though it were an art form. He listened to both sides with patience, bordering on obsession, taking meticulous notes, cross-referencing precedents, and weighing arguments for procedural soundness rather than ideological merit. His colleagues were drawn to this calm. To opponents, he seemed harmless. To allies, he seemed impartial. And in the intricate machinery of 19th-century governance, impartiality was a rare and valuable currency. Buchanan's talent for avoiding extremes translated into influence that few noticed. He quietly brokered compromises, arranged committee assignments, and guided legislation behind the scenes. By never appearing to favor one faction, he gained trust from multiple camps simultaneously. Power accrued without display, and reputation for fairness grew like ivy over the walls of his career. Yet his neutrality was not just tactical, it reflected a deeper philosophy. He believed that open confrontation threatened the stability of institutions and the country itself. Strong opinions, emotional leadership, and moral certainty all carried the risk of inciting chaos. By contrast, indecision and compromise, in his view, allowed the Republic to endure. He equated delay with prudence and caution with responsibility. This approach produced notable successes. Buchanan helped navigate the contentious debates over tariffs and infrastructure, ensuring that no single faction could dominate policy. He earned praise for keeping the Union together in times when partisanship threatened collapse. He became the go-to legislator for delicate negotiations that required subtlety, patience, and discretion. However, the very qualities that made him a master negotiator also fostered dangerous habits. Avoiding extremes became synonymous with avoiding action. Delay became a reflex, not a strategy. Every political choice was filtered through the lens of risk minimization, not moral imperative. As tensions over slavery and territorial expansion mounted, this pattern would have catastrophic consequences. Outside the chamber, Buchanan's reputation for neutrality shaped how he was perceived by constituents and rivals alike. He was courteous, never confrontational, and almost entirely devoid of personal enmity. His calm demeanor inspired confidence, yet masked the reality that his method was fundamentally reactive rather than proactive. He could navigate chaos with skill, but he could not create leadership in the absence of rules. Buchanan's rise by non-commitment also illustrates a paradox that would define his presidency. The more he succeeded by waiting and observing, the more he trained himself to see inaction as virtue. Compromise became instinctive. Silence became safe. In the moment, he seemed unshakable. History would later judge him as paralyzed. While the nation's divisions deepened and the pressures for decisive action grew, Buchanan's comfort with neutrality insulated him from urgency. He had become a master of influence without confrontation, a strategist who could shape outcomes while leaving credit and blame elsewhere. In his mind, the system worked best when he did not claim it outright. Yet the very skill that brought him power quietly sowed the seeds of vulnerability. When the moment arrived to lead decisively on the issues that could not be negotiated away, neutrality offered no guidance. Influence without visible responsibility was no substitute for leadership that required courage, moral clarity, and timely intervention. As he climbed higher, the question emerged: can a man who has perfected the art of waiting ever act when history refuses to wait? Stay with us as the secrets grow even darker. Power without visibility. By the time James Buchanan entered the higher echelons of Congress, he had perfected a remarkable skill, exerting influence without ever appearing to claim it. While other politicians relied on speeches, campaigns, and public recognition to assert authority, Buchanan mastered the quiet corridors of power, operating in the shadows of committees, procedural rules, and private negotiations. His hand shaped legislation while his name remained in the background. He understood the machinery of government better than anyone else. Committee assignments, parliamentary motions, and procedural loopholes were not mere technicalities, they were levers of control. Buchanan manipulated them with surgical precision, quietly steering outcomes in ways that appeared organic or inevitable. Colleagues often discovered the results of his maneuvering long after the fact, impressed but never certain who had orchestrated it. Buchanan's invisibility allowed him to survive politically even as alliances shifted violently around him. During a time when party loyalty was fluid and regional tensions threatened to fracture the legislature, he remained untouchable. He avoided the spotlight, refused public credit, and never created enemies unnecessarily. The paradox was clear. The less visible he became, the more indispensable he appeared. Beyond survival, Buchanan's behind-the-scenes power granted him strategic freedom. He could negotiate with northern and southern interests simultaneously, crafting compromises that satisfied neither fully but postponed confrontation. His distance from public opinion shielded him from popular pressure, allowing him to make coldly calculated decisions without the interference of emotion or outrage. This approach, however, reinforced a dangerous habit: reliance on delay as a tool of leadership. By shaping outcomes indirectly and waiting for consensus to emerge, Buchanan trained himself to equate inaction with prudence. Decisions requiring moral courage or urgent intervention were filtered through a lens of procedural safety. Action became a last resort rather than a first necessity. Even during moments of high tension abroad, his style translated seamlessly. As Minister to Britain, Buchanan handled delicate international negotiations with the same invisible authority he had honed at home. His counterparts often praised his discretion and diplomacy, unaware that much of the leverage they experienced came from his subtle manipulation of information and timing. Success seemed effortless, yet it required constant attention to detail, foresight, and patience, a combination few could sustain. Within Congress, his ability to operate unseen also earned him respect across ideological lines. Radical reformers and conservative stalwarts alike relied on his counsel, not realizing that Buchanan's ultimate allegiance was to order itself rather than to any cause. He built a network of dependence and influence that left him isolated in name but omnipresent in effect. Yet the very qualities that made him powerful behind the curtain would later define his presidency in ways history would remember unfavorably. A leader who excels in quiet control may thrive in times of routine negotiation, but the crises that demand visible, decisive action reveal the limits of invisible authority. When the nation's moral and political structures began to fracture, Buchanan's style offered no guidance. Influence without visibility could not compel loyalty, resolve conflict, or prevent secession. By carefully avoiding confrontation, cultivating procedural mastery, and leveraging discretion as armor, Buchanan became a man who could move the nation quietly, but who had yet to confront the human storm looming beyond the legislature's walls. When the safety of invisibility becomes second nature, can a leader ever step fully into the light when the country demands it? Stay close as the layers continue to peel back. Success in silence abroad. Buchanan's talent for quiet influence reached its apex on foreign soil. Appointed Minister to Britain, he entered an environment where every word carried weight, where reputations were fragile, and where diplomacy demanded subtlety far beyond the public eye. In London, he thrived, not by charm, speeches, or spectacle, but by meticulous preparation, timing, and patience. He observed every nuance of British politics, memorized alliances, and anticipated the consequences of every treaty clause. While other envoys relied on grand gestures or rhetoric, Buchanan relied on knowledge. He wrote reports filled with detail, forecasting economic trends, predicting political shifts, and laying groundwork for decades of American negotiation advantage. His superiors at home hailed him as a man who could succeed without drama, an asset in an era when mistakes abroad could have domestic repercussions. Buchanan's diplomacy often involved long periods of inactivity, yet each pause was calculated. He allowed disputes to simmer, observing carefully before intervening. Opponents sometimes misread his silence as indecision. In reality, it was a deliberate strategy. Time itself became a tool. By letting tension build before acting, he shaped outcomes in ways less overt but ultimately more durable. One of his notable achievements abroad involved trade negotiations with Britain. While the press at home celebrated no headlines, Buchanan quietly secured agreements that protected American shipping interests and maintained peace during a period of rising global tension. His success was invisible to the public, but invaluable to the nation. In every dispatch to Washington, he emphasized patience, prudence, and procedural precision, the same qualities that had served him domestically but now gained international significance. Yet these successes abroad also reinforced a dangerous assumption. Buchanan began to believe that patience could solve nearly every problem, that time would allow conflicts to resolve themselves if handled carefully enough. In diplomacy, this often worked. At home, he would later apply the same principle to a nation on the brink of civil war, with drastically different consequences. Buchanan's experiences overseas also shaped his perception of leadership. He saw power not as spectacle or charisma, but as quiet guidance, as the ability to manipulate circumstances with minimal visibility. Negotiation, observation, and timing became his preferred instruments. Emotional appeals, moral urgency, or public confrontation were unnecessary distractions. This approach earned him admiration from colleagues and foreign counterparts alike. Britain, France, and other powers recognized Buchanan's competence and reliability. They noted his steadiness, his knowledge of law, and his uncanny ability to navigate delicate situations. In a world driven by influence and perception, Buchanan wielded authority while remaining almost invisible, a ghost in the corridors of power. At the same time, this period abroad deepened his comfort with detachment. He became increasingly confident that crises could be managed by procedural patience alone, a mindset that insulated him from the emotional and ethical urgency of domestic conflicts. He returned to the United States with victories in hand, yet unaware that the methods that worked internationally would soon fail catastrophically at home. By the time he returned, Buchanan believed the world could be persuaded by method, calm, and time. But he had yet to encounter a storm that refused to wait. The lesson of silent success abroad would soon collide with a nation that demanded more than patient observation. If patience could achieve peace overseas, what would happen when patience met a country tearing itself apart at home? Stay here as the next twist unfolds. The moral question he refused to touch. Returning from Europe, Buchanan faced a domestic reality that no diplomat's patience could resolve. Slavery, once a distant concern framed in legal abstractions, had become a violent moral and political crisis threatening to unravel the Union. Southern states demanded protection of their institution. Northern states increasingly called for restriction. The nation was no longer debating policy, it was confronting its conscience. Buchanan responded as he always had, with calculation, procedure, and avoidance of emotion. He refused to take a clear moral position on slavery, framing disputes as legal questions rather than ethical imperatives. He argued that the Constitution protected the rights of slaveholding states and that interference could not be justified. To him, moral judgment could destabilize the careful equilibrium he had spent a lifetime cultivating. In private correspondence, Buchanan revealed his belief that the Union's survival depended on suppressing passionate debate. He feared that addressing the moral dimensions of slavery would inflame the country and spark disunion. He viewed moral engagement not as leadership, but as a dangerous deviation from process, a step into unpredictability he had learned to avoid. This deliberate avoidance of moral confrontation was unprecedented. Previous presidents had wavered, yet most had engaged at least symbolically with the nation's conscience. Buchanan did not. He treated slavery as a legal matter, an issue of state versus federal authority, rather than the human tragedy it had become. Historians would later describe this as a moral paralysis, the refusal to confront what was undeniable, because it risked political stability. Buchanan's stance further emboldened extremists in both the North and South. Southern leaders interpreted his legalistic neutrality as tacit approval. Northern abolitionists grew frustrated at the absence of opposition. His detachment, intended to preserve unity, instead sharpened divisions. By avoiding moral engagement, he created a vacuum in leadership that no law could fill. Yet Buchanan's personal philosophy explained his response. He believed that passion and morality were inherently destabilizing forces. Law was orderly, procedure was predictable, emotion was unpredictable. By reframing slavery as a constitutional rather than ethical issue, he could remain in control, or so he believed. Over time, this belief hardened into a guiding principle. Personal conscience and national conscience alike were subordinated to his strict procedural lens, leaving him insulated from moral urgency and increasingly incapable of seeing the human suffering that unfolded around him. The consequences were immediate. Tensions over new territories, states' rights, and the spread of slavery escalated rapidly. Compromise, which had once been his greatest strength, now proved insufficient. The nation's moral and political fissures were widening faster than the rules could contain them. Buchanan's moral detachment also alienated potential allies. Moderates who sought leadership capable of bridging conscience and policy found him unresponsive. Extremists saw no resistance. His commitment to procedure over principle became a signal that, in moments of ethical crisis, he would step aside. As debates grew more violent and public outrage intensified, his silence was interpreted not as caution, but as cowardice, deepening distrust and leaving the Union increasingly vulnerable to the forces it could no longer restrain. In this phase of his life, Buchanan revealed the deepest limitation of his career-long approach. His reliance on order, neutrality, and legal reasoning could succeed abroad, in committees and in negotiation, but it could not answer questions of right and wrong at a moment when the nation demanded clarity. The question then became unavoidable. When the moral center of a nation collapses, can a leader survive by hiding behind the law alone? Stay with us to see what lies ahead. Expansion without reckoning. While moral questions roiled the nation, Buchanan's attention turned to another form of national ambition: territorial expansion. The lure of land, resources, and influence offered a concrete task where his methodical mind could excel without confronting the ethical storms at home. He pursued treaties and acquisitions with the precision of a lawyer drafting contracts, carefully calculating risks and rewards. The annexation of new territories during this period was not merely administrative, it reshaped the country's demographic and political landscape. Buchanan supported efforts to incorporate regions such as Kansas and Utah under federal oversight, emphasizing orderly settlement and legal compliance. Yet these expansions also reopened debates over the extension of slavery, a question he continued to frame purely in constitutional terms. Each treaty, each territorial adjustment was another instance where growth advanced while the underlying national crisis festered unresolved. Buchanan's legalistic approach allowed him to avoid direct confrontation with powerful local interests. In territories where settlers and local governments clashed violently, he prioritized maintaining federal authority over mediating moral disputes. His dispatches reflected a deep confidence that law and procedure would eventually balance competing claims. He rarely considered that expansion without addressing fundamental social issues could exacerbate sectional tensions. Internationally, Buchanan's strategy enhanced America's standing. European powers recognized that he could negotiate, codify, and secure agreements with minimal fanfare, creating borders that were stable on paper, even if unrest simmered beneath. Diplomacy abroad succeeded because outcomes could be controlled. Morally explosive issues at home, however, remained impervious to procedure. Domestically, expansion masked the deepening fracture over slavery. By concentrating on geographic growth, Buchanan allowed political attention to focus on new states, territories, and treaties, rather than the human suffering and ethical dilemmas that those expansions created. His management of policy became a kind of deflection. The nation moved forward materially, while the moral and political rot deepened invisibly. Even supporters who admired his skill at negotiation abroad and at home could not see that each successful territorial agreement carried seeds of division. Buchanan's reliance on law and procedure gave the appearance of accomplishment, but beneath the surface, sectional tensions widened. New territories became flashpoints, slavery debates intensified, and compromise became more fragile with every inch of land acquired. Buchanan's obsession with order and legality blinded him to the long-term consequences of expansion without reckoning. He viewed treaties as solutions rather than triggers of conflict, forgetting that human ambition and moral tension rarely obey procedural frameworks. In striving to preserve unity through law, he inadvertently set the stage for disunion. Additionally, Buchanan's temperament amplified these challenges. His reliance on calculation over intuition, precedent over principle, and patience over decisive action meant that urgent warnings from anti-slavery and abolitionist factions often went unheeded. The practical successes of his policies could not prevent the rising tide of sectional fear and resentment, leaving him unprepared for the inevitable clash that his legalistic mindset failed to anticipate. This phase of his career demonstrates the double edge of his skills. Precision and caution could secure borders, treaties, and resources, yet they could not reconcile a divided nation or address the ethical crises simmering alongside growth. Buchanan excelled in creating structure, but structure alone could not replace moral leadership or courage in a nation teetering on the brink. When a country's boundaries stretch but its conscience is ignored, how long before the cracks can no longer be contained? Come with us into the truth that was never meant to surface. The presidency built on legal faith. When James Buchanan finally ascended to the presidency in 1857, the nation expected calm, order, and expertise. Few questioned his credentials. After decades of congressional service, diplomatic victories, and procedural mastery, he appeared uniquely suited to guide a country already fraying at the edges. What Americans did not realize was that his greatest strength, faith in law and procedure, would also become his most dangerous flaw. Buchanan entered the White House with unwavering confidence that the Constitution itself could solve political discord if interpreted and enforced with care. He believed the nation's founding document was self-executing, an objective framework that would stabilize society if citizens and leaders simply obeyed it. Morality, passion, and public outrage were, in his view, variables best excluded from the machinery of government. To him, leadership was not inspiration or persuasion, it was administration. The early months of his presidency revealed both the power and limitations of this mindset. Buchanan immediately immersed himself in the minutiae of governance. He reviewed legislative bills, scrutinized judicial appointments, and monitored territorial disputes with the precision of a legal scholar. His staff marveled at his memory, his attention to detail, and his ability to foresee the cascading consequences of policy. In a time of routine administration, he was unmatched, yet the country was not merely routine. Economic uncertainty, social unrest, and the intensifying debate over slavery demanded judgment beyond law. The Panic of 1857 struck within months of his inauguration, triggering widespread financial panic. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment surged. Buchanan addressed the crisis with measured correspondence and appeals to precedent. He refused extraordinary interventions, insisting that established legal and financial mechanisms would naturally correct themselves. While his actions were technically correct, they failed to stem public panic or inspire confidence. Simultaneously, sectional tensions intensified. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened new territories to popular sovereignty, igniting violent conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. Buchanan interpreted these disputes strictly as legal questions of state rights and territorial governance, downplaying moral and humanitarian dimensions. He viewed each violent incident as an isolated legal issue to be resolved through judicial review rather than as a symptom of a nation splitting at its core. Buchanan's reliance on procedure extended to appointments and cabinet management. He chose advisers who would operate within rules and processes rather than challenge him with ethical or emotional urgency. He avoided conflict in his inner circle, seeking staff who would execute policies faithfully rather than advocate morally driven strategies. This created a presidency technically disciplined, strategically cautious, but emotionally and morally disengaged. His approach worked in controlled circumstances. diplomatic correspondence remained precise. Domestic disputes, where law was clear, were administered with efficiency. But crises fueled by human anger, fear, or conviction, the very crises defining the era, found no solution in meticulous adherence to precedent. For every legal victory Buchanan achieved, a moral failure quietly grew alongside it. Buchanan's legal faith also shaped his public communication. He spoke in precise, measured tones, avoiding grand declarations or emotional appeals. He emphasized constitutional authority, legality, and order. Speeches that might have mobilized citizens to moral action were instead delivered as technical expositions, earning admiration from legal scholars but failing to rally public trust or ethical conviction. The nation could see competence but not courage. Historians argue that Buchanan believed history rewarded patience and compliance with process. He thought that as long as he acted within constitutional boundaries, the Union would endure. His prior success in Congress and diplomacy reinforced this belief. Abroad, treaties and negotiations had resolved tense situations without moral confrontation. Now he assumed that the same methods would work domestically, even as violent clashes in Kansas and political strife in Washington revealed the limits of procedural governance. Buchanan's legalistic presidency also shaped his response to the Supreme Court's decisions on slavery. In the infamous Dred Scott case, he celebrated the court's rulings as correct interpretations of the Constitution. He failed to anticipate the moral outrage they would provoke or the way they would accelerate sectional conflict. To him, law was above politics and ethics. To the nation, it became a symbol of division, highlighting his inability or unwillingness to engage with the moral dimensions of leadership. Even his cabinet appointments reflected his obsession with rules over people. He selected men whose loyalty to process outweighed their moral judgment, creating a team technically competent but often morally inert. As tensions grew, his administration became a theater of legal compliance rather than ethical action, mirroring Buchanan's personal philosophy, that restraint and procedure equaled leadership, and that moral or emotional engagement was risky and secondary. This reliance on legal faith also manifested in Buchanan's territorial policies. He oversaw the admission of new states, negotiated treaties, and regulated westward expansion with procedural exactitude. Each act expanded the Union geographically while leaving unresolved the explosive question of slavery. Territory grew, infrastructure advanced, and borders were codified, all without addressing the human suffering and political volatility accompanying expansion. His achievements were tangible yet morally and politically hollow, evidence of a leader capable of movement but incapable of decisive moral guidance. In essence, Buchanan's presidency was a study in paradox. His intellect, experience, and precision made him extraordinarily effective at technical administration. Yet the very qualities that enabled success in neutral, controlled circumstances rendered him dangerously ineffective when history demanded moral courage, decisive leadership, and engagement with human urgency. The Constitution, which he revered, became a crutch rather than a shield, unable to compensate for inaction in the face of national fracture. As Buchanan moved deeper into office, the cracks in the Union widened faster than his procedural solutions could mend them. The country demanded more than legalism. It demanded presence, moral clarity, and action. Buchanan, faithful to his lifelong principles, had none of these to offer. So when a president trusts the Constitution to act as a compass while the nation's conscience collapses around him, can order alone prevent the inevitable fracture? Stay with us as the untold details rise to light. The months when America began to break. By the late months of Buchanan's presidency, the nation was no longer debating the morality of slavery or the legality of state sovereignty. It was moving toward rupture, and the pace of history had overtaken even his most meticulous calculations. States began openly threatening secession, and tensions escalated into public declarations, violent confrontations, and political maneuvering that demanded immediate, decisive leadership. Buchanan, however, responded in the only way he knew, with delay, calculation, and procedural observation. Early warning signs appeared after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. Southern leaders viewed Lincoln as a direct threat to slavery and state autonomy, despite his assurances that he would not interfere where slavery already existed. South Carolina led the charge, calling a convention to consider secession. Buchanan observed these developments with a scholar's detachment, noting the legal arguments, consulting advisers, and weighing precedents. Publicly, he issued statements emphasizing the limits of presidential authority, framing the crisis as a matter for Congress and the courts rather than the executive branch. Privately, his deliberation was exhaustive. He studied the Constitution, revisited prior precedents regarding state rebellion, and examined foreign examples of federal fragmentation. Advisers urged immediate action to prevent secession. Senators called for strong federal measures. Governors demanded clarity. Yet Buchanan's instinct, honed over decades of legal and procedural devotion, was to avoid intervention unless absolute authority was unquestionable. To him, acting prematurely might set a dangerous precedent or escalate violence, an argument rooted in principle, yet tragically ill-suited for a nation on the brink. As states began seceding one by one, Buchanan's administration attempted to manage appearances while avoiding confrontation. Federal forts in the South became tense flashpoints. He issued orders to maintain government property but refused to escalate militarily, insisting that the Constitution limited executive power in the absence of rebellion that directly threatened federal authority. His belief in the law as self-executing left him paralyzed in the face of an accelerating crisis that demanded moral judgment as much as constitutional interpretation. Meanwhile, political factions in Washington and across the states scrambled to fill the leadership vacuum Buchanan created. Southern leaders interpreted his caution as tacit acquiescence, emboldening further secession. Northern moderates grew frustrated at the lack of decisive action to uphold the Union. Political newspapers criticized him for failing to assert authority. Yet Buchanan remained steadfast, convinced that restraint was the highest form of governance and that visible intervention could provoke more chaos than it prevented. Historians note that these months highlight a defining pattern in Buchanan's leadership. Where other presidents might have acted with moral conviction or seized initiative in the face of uncertainty, Buchanan analyzed, documented, and delayed. Every decision was filtered through legal reasoning and procedural precedent, yet the human, emotional, and political urgency of the moment continued to mount. The machinery of government operated smoothly, but the country itself was fracturing. The president's correspondence from this period reveals a man consumed by principle but detached from reality. Letters to advisers, diplomats, and governors are meticulous, filled with constitutional citations and historical references. There is little acknowledgement of the fear, anger, and urgency gripping citizens. He viewed mass unrest as a problem of authority, not a symptom of societal collapse. This intellectualization of crisis insulated him from the raw stakes of human conflict, leaving him unable to mobilize decisive action to prevent catastrophe. Even his closest advisers struggled to influence him. Calls for martial preparedness, federal enforcement, or preemptive diplomacy were met with reminders of constitutional constraints and legal limits. He insisted that only Congress could act in certain situations and that the executive must not overstep its bounds. His deep belief in rules and procedure, once a strength in diplomacy and committee negotiations, became a fatal weakness as momentum toward disunion accelerated. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens and state leaders watched as the Union seemed unable to respond to the mounting crisis. Panic and uncertainty spread in the South and North alike. Newspapers chronicled debates over loyalty, rebellion, and the legitimacy of secession conventions. Violence erupted sporadically, yet Buchanan's administration maintained a stance of careful observation rather than proactive intervention. By failing to assert moral or political authority, he allowed events to move beyond the reach of his measured approach. By December of 1860, with South Carolina officially seceding, it became clear that Buchanan's philosophy of governance had reached its limit. Law and precedent were insufficient to restrain human ambition and sectional fear. Procedural caution, which had once won him respect and influence, now rendered him effectively powerless. His administration could negotiate treaties, manage bureaucracy, and maintain appearances, but it could not prevent the unraveling of the nation itself. In these months, Buchanan exemplified the danger of over-reliance on technical skill and detachment in moments of moral and political crisis. His meticulous nature, legal expertise, and diplomatic patience, assets for most of his career, proved inadequate against the urgent human forces tearing the country apart. The president who had mastered silence and neutrality now faced a nation that demanded decisive action, courage, and empathy, qualities he had long suppressed. Observers of history often wonder whether Buchanan could have prevented the Civil War if he had chosen differently. The evidence from these months paints a stark reality. A man trained to manage systems, interpret law, and maintain equilibrium was ill-equipped to confront chaos fueled by ideology, fear, and moral conflict. His paralysis was not born of ignorance, incompetence, or ill will, but of a worldview that equated restraint with leadership, law with justice, and observation with intervention. In retrospect, these months define the tragic essence of Buchanan's presidency. He had prepared his entire life to lead in calm, controlled environments, yet history demanded leadership in the storm. He applied the tools that had brought success for decades: legal precision, procedural mastery, neutrality, but they were powerless in a nation unmoored from compromise and unity. By the time the first cannon of civil conflict would fire, the Union had already slipped beyond the reach of careful calculation. As states broke away and history began moving faster than any procedure could manage, the nation faced a question that no law could answer. What becomes of a country when its leader refuses to act while the fracture grows irreversible? Stay with us, because the biggest revelation is still ahead. Remembered not for what he did, but what he allowed. As James Buchanan prepared to leave the presidency in March of 1861, the nation he had inherited in calm and order no longer existed. States had seceded, institutions teetered on collapse, and the people's faith in leadership had been severely tested. The Union he believed law and procedure could preserve was unraveling, not because of external enemies, but because the machinery of governance alone could not address human ambition, fear, and moral urgency. Buchanan's final months in office were a testament to a philosophy that had guided him for decades: restraint, procedural adherence, and an unwavering trust in systems over sentiment. He continued to issue statements emphasizing the limits of presidential authority, insisting that Congress, not the executive, must act to preserve the nation. Federal troops were mobilized only minimally and reactively, leaving state militias and secessionist conventions unchallenged. In every decision he measured legality over morality, avoiding confrontation with a nation on the brink. Within his administration, debate raged privately over the proper response to secession. Advisers argued for decisive intervention, including preemptive military action to secure federal forts and suppress rebellion. Buchanan dismissed these recommendations, citing constitutional limits and the dangers of overreach. In his mind, acting beyond explicit authority would create a precedent more dangerous than the immediate threat. His devotion to process over human urgency blinded him to the reality that waiting had already set irreversible events into motion. The president's detachment from the moral and emotional dimensions of leadership became increasingly apparent. Where citizens demanded reassurance, he offered legal rationale. Where governors demanded decisive action, he offered citations of authority. Where the nation's conscience called for ethical guidance, he provided procedural instruction. Buchanan's approach maintained the appearance of order, but in truth, it allowed chaos to accelerate. In the capital, whispers about his inaction grew louder. Senators and representatives openly criticized his reluctance to act, yet Buchanan remained unshaken. He had spent a lifetime cultivating credibility through neutrality and caution. Now, however, the very skills that had brought respect, his attention to precedent, procedural mastery, and avoidance of emotional engagement, made him appear impotent in the eyes of the public and historians alike. Meanwhile, the seceding states moved methodically. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas formally withdrew from the Union before Lincoln's inauguration. Buchanan's response was limited to formal protests and calls for negotiation. He refused to recognize secession as rebellion, framing it instead as a constitutional ambiguity beyond his unilateral authority. By refusing to define the crisis, he ceded initiative entirely to the secessionists. His indecision allowed momentum to build, turning what might have been isolated acts into a coordinated wave of withdrawal. Buchanan's correspondence during these months reveals a man acutely aware of the looming disaster, yet unwilling or perhaps unable to act beyond the boundaries of his philosophy. He worried that military action might ignite civil war prematurely, yet he failed to recognize that his inaction was already enabling the very outcome he feared. Letters to diplomats, advisors, and congressional leaders display a mind absorbed in legal detail and historical precedent, but detached from the human cost of delay. Historians have long debated whether Buchanan's failures were born of ignorance, indecision, or character flaws. The evidence suggests a more subtle truth. He was profoundly consistent in applying a worldview forged over decades. He believed that patience, procedure, and law could resolve conflict. He had succeeded in Congress and in foreign diplomacy precisely because these methods worked in controlled circumstances. When faced with an uncontrollable, morally urgent, and politically explosive crisis, however, those same principles became inadequate, even dangerous. The contrast between Buchanan's procedural competence and the moral and political urgency of secession was stark. In his mind, the law itself was sovereign. In reality, the nation's people, passions, and ambitions demanded a leader willing to act beyond precedent. By clinging to process, Buchanan allowed events to escape control. The Union was slipping from the grasp of law, even as he tried to preserve it. Even the mundane operations of government reflected this tension. Federal appointments continued, treaties were finalized, and the executive branch functioned with bureaucratic efficiency. Yet outside the doors of Washington, citizens and states were moving toward civil war. Buchanan's presidency had become a paradox, a technically flawless administration overseeing a nation in disintegration. In private, Buchanan expressed deep frustration with the impossibility of his position. Advisors encouraged him to assert authority, historians later note, but he remained trapped by a lifetime of principles. He could not reconcile his respect for law with the need for decisive, morally driven action. To act beyond his understanding of constitutional bounds would be a violation of everything he had believed necessary to govern. By refusing to compromise his principles, he inadvertently allowed the nation to fracture. By the end of his term, the consequences of this philosophy were undeniable. 7 states had seceded, federal forts were under threat, and the question of slavery had become inseparable from the survival of the Union itself. Buchanan's inaction did not merely fail to prevent conflict, It made the inevitability of war more certain. He had governed with fidelity to law and procedure, yet the cost of that fidelity was measured in the erosion of unity, trust, and public faith. After leaving office, Buchanan retreated into the solitude that had defined his personal and professional life. He wrote memoirs, reflected on constitutional principles, and attempted to explain his philosophy to posterity, yet history remembered him not for legislation passed, treaties negotiated, or speeches delivered. It remembered him for the void he left, the decisions he refused to make, the crises he failed to confront, and the moral and political vacuum that his steadfast adherence to process created. Buchanan's legacy is, therefore, uniquely tragic. A man of exceptional talent, intellect, and discipline became synonymous with inaction at the precise moment when action was demanded. He believed the Constitution could guide the nation through turmoil. Instead, his faith in law without moral engagement allowed the nation to edge toward war. His failure was not sudden, nor was it dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was methodical, consistent, and chilling in its quiet inevitability. In the end, James Buchanan stands as a cautionary figure in American history. He demonstrates the limits of procedural competence when confronted with human crises, the dangers of substituting law for leadership, and the consequences of a life devoted to neutrality and distance. His presidency illustrates that wisdom and experience, without courage and moral engagement, may fail when the nation itself demands action. As he walked away from the White House, leaving the Union fractured and the country teetering on the edge of war, Buchanan's final truth was stark. History does not forgive those who allow events to unfold without intervention, no matter how principled or skilled they may be. The legacy of a man who feared making the wrong move and instead made none at all was etched in the course of a nation on the brink of civil war. James Buchanan's story ends here, not with triumph, but with the haunting lesson of what happens when law and caution are trusted above courage, conviction, and the demands of history itself. Were you stunned by how James Buchanan's caution and personal choices shaped America's descent into crisis? Share which moment shocked you the most, and explore how history remembers the president who did nothing when everything demanded action.